Good evening. On behalf of Chancellor Wartell, I'd like to welcome you to the 14th series of the Omnibus Lecture Series. I'm Irene Walters, Executive Director of University Relations, and proud to be part of the committee that brings this series to you. We're very excited about this year, and I hope you are too. What do you think? Do you like the people we're going to have? Good. Of course, this could not be possible without the generosity of the English Bonner Mitchell Foundation. And also I want to thank our media sponsors, Wayne TV and NPR. Tonight, we are so pleased to kick off this series with a preeminent professor of Georgetown, and he is also an author, John Esposito, who will present the U.S. and Muslim world, what the next president should know. And don't we wish all the candidates were here to hear him. But not to fear, we're going to send each of them a DVD. Now, just a reminder about the format of the evening. After the lecture, we will have a question and answer period. Please raise your hand and an ambassador will come and give you the mic. And I just want to ask you, please, to ask concise questions so that we can have many questions rather than espousing your views. At the conclusion of the questions and answers, Professor Esposito will be signing his books, which will be for sale in the lobby. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Christina Smith, who was a student of Professor Esposito and who is now Special Assistant to the Chancellor of Taylor University, Fort Wayne. Christina?
It's no small order to follow Irene Walters and to precede John Esposito, but it is my pleasure to join Irene in welcoming you and to introduce our speaker tonight. Great men and women of history are often remembered according to the mottos by which they lived. For our President Teddy Roosevelt, that was to speak softly and carry a big stick, thinking you'd go far in life. This evening, we are fortunate to have with us someone who has truly established himself as a great man of our time and of history. In life and in perpetuity, John Esposito is known by a motto that might well be summarized as vigorously pursue mutual understanding with an attentive ear and a humble spirit and a prolific pen. Amidst the rants of ideologues and the violent rage of extremists, John Esposito is a reasoned, eloquent, and supremely humane voice of understanding, a voice that has perhaps done more good than any other in our time to bridge the divide between Islam and the West. In breaking with a long tradition of Western scholars who have spoken for Muslims in a voice and through intellectual paradigms that were distinctly Western in their orientation, Esposito has helped to lead the way to create a new research agenda that allows Muslims to speak in their own voice, on their own terms, and on equal footing with the West. And he's also helped in many powerful ways to train a new generation of scholars that have pursued an empirically driven, religiously sensitive approach to understanding Muslims and what they really think and believe. Our lecturer this evening was raised a Roman Catholic in an Italian neighborhood in the heart of Brooklyn. He began his life of thoughtful reflection and service in the humble setting of a Catholic monastery where he spent 10 years. Dr. John Esposito now holds the distinguished rank of university professor and is the professor of religion and international affairs, as well as the professor of Islamic studies at Georgetown University. He is also the founding director of the Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Christian-Muslim Understanding in the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. In his own words, the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding is concerned with Islam in the West and Islam in the West. The center exists to advance education, in the fields of Islamic civilization and Muslim-Christian understanding, and to facilitate cross-cultural and interreligious dialogue. The center addresses critical issues, including the much-debated clash of civilizations and the compatibility of Islam and the modern life, from democratization and pluralism to the status of women, minorities, and human rights, and the American foreign policy throughout the Muslim world. Dr. Esposito also works as a senior scientist at the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, where he co-authored the recently released Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think. Who Speaks for Islam brings data-driven answers to one of the most consequential debates of our times. What do Muslims really believe about terrorism, America, democracy, and the role of women in society? Esposito's book is based upon Gallup's completion of more than 50,000 face-to-face, one-hour interviews over the span of 6 years with residents of more than 35 nations that are either predominantly Muslim or have substantial Muslim populations. The result is the largest and most comprehensive poll of the Muslim world, representing voices that are young and old, educated and illiterate, female and male, urban and rural, making this the largest, most comprehensive study of contemporary Muslims ever done. Professor Esposito earned his PhD from Temple University in 1974. He has held appointments at Harvard and Oxford universities and continues to serve as a much sought-after consultant to the Department of State, numerous corporations, universities, and the media worldwide. He's used that prolific pen to author or co-author what I thought was more than 32 books, but he corrected me tonight, it's more than 35, including serving as editor-in-chief of the 4-volume Oxford Encyclopedia of the Modern Islamic World. This evening, Dr. Esposito joins us to address the timely topic, the United States and the Muslim world, what the next president should know. Please join me in giving a warm Hoosier welcome to a truly great man and voice of our time, Dr. John Esposito.
I have to remember to tell my wife that I went out with a bottle to speak tonight. I won't tell her what kind of bottle I came out with. But in any case, I really want to thank the Chancellor and the faculty for their gracious invitation, and also, although I'm only here a limited amount of time, for the way in which I've been received and managed today and handled today. I am especially grateful for the very generous introduction, which is accurate and precise, and I probably could have gone on a little longer. No, I'm especially grateful for that because it enables me to skip the first page or so of some of my introductory comments. We live in very difficult times, and this past week has certainly reinforced that sense. If for many of us, as we approach the 21st century, we had hopes and dreams, and many of us did, of sort of new things on the horizon. For me, in terms of the work I do, it was going from a situation in the late 60s and early 70s where no one was interested in Islam, where Muslims were invisible in our landscape, and moving into a 21st century where Islam was not only the second largest of the world's religions, but the second or third largest religion in Europe and America, and where Muslims, certainly in America, to a lesser extent in Europe, were becoming more and more part of the landscape. The difference is remarkable. My brother was the vice chancellor at Oakland University, and I remember visiting him in Oakland, Michigan, and going out for a car ride, and there was an Islamic center, a Hindu temple, etc., and thinking, none of this existed when I was younger. But 9/11 came along, and that changed a lot of things very dramatically. The work that we do at the center, a center that we created in 1993, was as one of the members of my international committee said, set back probably some 20 years. I thought 10 was accurate, but I think 20 years is more accurate. We've seen a situation where post 9/11, anti-Americanism has grown globally. And by here, I'm not talking about extremists, okay? Anti-Americanism, which is found throughout Europe. If you're not aware of it, just go to Europe and start talking to people about American policy or these presidential elections. And found throughout the Muslim world and found in many parts of Latin America and Africa, etc. At the same time, we see violence, and often unpredictable violence, breaking out when we least expect it. And we've seen it throughout the Muslim world. And remember that the vast majority of victims of terrorists are Muslims. And we've seen it in Washington, New York, London, Madrid, and more recently in Yemen, Pakistan, and Somalia. And certainly for people like myself, when I look at the bombing of the Marriott Hotel in Pakistan, that is a hotel that I would normally always want to stay at. And so, there's a kind of personal side to that. But we also see, rather than an increased knowledge, awareness, and empathy in many parts of the world for the situation of vast majorities of Muslims, we actually see the situation deteriorating after about 2003. In other words, after 9/11, there was actually a more positive response than actually has occurred in more recent years. We see a growing Islamophobia. Islamophobia is sort of the Muslim equivalent of anti-Semitism. It is a discrimination against Muslims, both religiously and also culturally. We see that spreading in Europe and America. All you need to do is put on your TV and you can watch a number of channels. I don't have to knock Fox for this. You can watch certain people on CNN, let alone on other channels, and they say things about Muslims, not about Muslim extremists only, but about Muslims and Islam that you would never say about Jews and Christians or the Bible. Some are as mindless, as uncritical, and as hate-driven. You have anti-immigrant politicians in Europe referring to the Quran as Mein Kampf, saying that Muslims should be deported, not just extremists, but Muslims should be deported, etc. So there are issues here. Is the world getting better and safer? I don't know. I've always been an optimist, but as far as I can tell, I keep saying now things will probably get worse before they get better. And clearly now with the economic problems that we have, it's kind of mind-boggling at the end of the day. Part of the problem we have, though, after 9/11 is how are you to understand what's going on? Years ago, it wouldn't matter. Most of you wouldn't come to a talk like this. And at the end of the day, you would say, as many students would say, why take that course? It's not relevant, etc. And now we realize that with globalization in a globalized world, we are so interconnected with the whole world, and certainly relations between the U.S. and the Muslim world, not just the Arab world, but the Muslim world. Issues of security, issues of access to oil, a whole host of issues. Whether or not countries broaden and democratize is not simply their business, it's something sometimes we have to be concerned about. If they have authoritarian regimes in the old days, we just say, well, it didn't matter whether a Republican or a Democratic president. We could talk about promoting democracy, but why do it in the Arab and Muslim world when we know that they may be authoritarian rulers, they may be, as some used to say during the Cold War of other parts of the world, bloody bastards, but they're our bloody bastards. We can count on them at critical points, so we'll look the other way when it comes to authoritarianism. But what we discover is that the reality of it is that authoritarian regimes and the use of repression, that can work for a limited period of time, but it creates a pressure cooker effect. And when that pressure cooker blows in a globalized world, that can have tremendous repercussions across the world. With globalization, again, of communications, people across the world, the whole world's watching and see it. With globalization of travel, people can move now across the world to fight in battles that they are concerned about, not just send money across the world. And indeed, I don't just mean terrorists. The United States does this and continues to threaten to do that, as indeed many nations would, depending on whether or not they see their security or their national interest threatened. But how do you get a fix on this? Do you watch your media experts, whether liberal or conservative, who on Monday talk to you about Social Security, on Tuesday they're experts on health care, on Wednesday the market, on Thursday Muslim extremism? It's amazing how much people like O'Reilly and Stephanopoulos, to take two ends of the spectrum, how much they know. It absolutely fascinates me very often. Or do you rely on academic experts? The great thing about our country, certainly in the last 30 years, is that we now have an incredible number of books and articles and the internet, etc., to learn about Islam and the Muslim world. Almost none of that existed when I first became an academic. In fact, I like to say something, which I will say because I know the reporter is here who asked me about it, and I had said it earlier this afternoon, but I want to say it publicly so it's not misunderstood. A favorite line of mine is that when I decided to study Islam, people said I would never get a job, and they were right. In '74, when I finished, there was no job to teach Islam. I was hired to teach other things. And I often say that it wasn't until '78, '79, having lived in an ivory tower that was sort of like the Maytag repairman where no one ever called, and then along came the Iranian Revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini, and I owe my career and my Lexus to the Ayatollah Khomeini. Now, that is not meant as a pro-Iran statement. That is simply meant as a reality check. We are a market-driven society. You do your dissertation on Herodotus and publish a book on it, terrific. What will your royalties look like? How many lectures will you be asked to give rather than somebody who deals with a more marketable topic? So we are driven by political realities, we're driven by economic realities. Now we've got all these books out there, and who are you going to believe? You have myself and others who think roughly in the same school of thought, and you have a second school of thought represented by people like Bernard Lewis, Daniel Pipes, Steve Emerson, Martin Kramer, and Legion. But of course we know that Christ cast out the legion of devils, but I won't go that way. I will not appeal to Christian scriptures to make my point. But the fact is, what do? You have experts who can have degrees from the same universities. I always use the example of, years ago when we debated the whole question about were cigarettes dangerous. And you could have, working for Liggett & Meyer, a PhD from one of the top universities, Ivy League schools, with the company, in effect saying, not to worry. And on the other hand, you could have, in the lobby against that, a PhD from perhaps the same university, arguing the other way. The same thing happens when you look at experts. We have a different take on it, and so who are you to believe? The situation is compounded even more by the fact that we live in a society which is in many ways shout television. It's the strident voices. We don't have laid-back interviews now. The idea is to be very aggressive. People like John McLaughlin and others started that, but now you see that all the time, the kind of debate, but also in your face to kind of hold an audience. And you put up people of polar opposite positions who really go at it. Well, then when you got this shout approach, they get the attention. We're a soundbite society. When a Jerry Falwell, who's no longer with us, a Pat Robertson, and a host of other people say things like, the prophet is a pedophile, that's a soundbite. Cameras go on. When Osama bin Laden makes a terrorist statement, the media cues to that. When 300 Muslim leaders around the world denounce terrorism, where are the media stories? I'm asked in every talk I give, somebody gets up and says, why don't Muslims denounce terrorism? How come they didn't? They have. The statements have been made by major leaders, minor leaders, and they're available in public space, but mostly on the internet. Why don't you read them in the newspapers? Call up and ask your newspapers why you don't. That doesn't make news. If they call for jihad against the West, that does make news. It's simply a reality. A friend of mine published a really good book called Less Safe, Less Free. It looks at the Bush policy post 9/11 and says, in effect, this war on terrorism in terms of domestic policy is we're less safe and less free. But I remember him saying to me, and he's somebody who's published before, that his new publisher said, have you ever published something that was controversial and got people upset? And he said, well, no, not really. He writes very well, and people may disagree, but they don't. And the publisher said, too bad. Because we know what sells a book is not only a good review, a lousy review in the New York Times can sell a book. If O'Reilly praises you, and I've done the O'Reilly show, it'll spike. But if O'Reilly condemns you, it'll probably also spike. Rather than if nobody talks about you, if they're quiet about it. Well, what's remarkable about the Gallup World Poll, and with the volume we've been able to develop as a result of that data, is that now you don't have to be caught in the middle of the battle of the academic experts, the battle of the terrorism experts, the battle of the talking heads. You're not simply dependent on them. You're not simply dependent when you want to know what Muslims think, as if you wanted to know about Christians think, with specific leaders, individual leaders. You now can listen to voices that represent 1 billion of the 1.3 billion Muslims in the world. So you want to know what Muslim women have to say? We now have the data. It's not a matter of what I tell you Muslim women have to say, however much I'm out in the Muslim world and around. And then you're saying, but gee, so-and-so says something else. Now you know what Muslim women, what their priorities are. Let me talk a bit about this, because this would be my message to the candidates and to the next president of the United States. The first part would be to say, this is being recorded, okay? And I'm from Brooklyn, so I have to kind of be very balanced here. The first part would be to say, we've gone astray. Or, in many ways, we've screwed up, whether Democratic or Republican administrations. As President Bush's senior State Department official said when we were about to invade Iraq and there were no weapons of mass destruction, at least none that other than the vice president knew existed. And as Mr. Haas said, he said, the reason we were going in was that we were going to do what no president in the past, Republican or Democrat, sadly, nor President Bush in his first term had done. And that is to really seriously think about promoting democracy. What he said in his speech was that we had to admit that America had practiced democratic exceptionalism. Democratic exceptionalism. In other words, we espouse and promote self-determination and democracy in many parts of the world, particularly after the fall of the Soviet Union, but not in the Arab and Muslim world, where we continue to support authoritarian rulers, okay, for a variety of reasons. That statement stands right out there. And a number of other policies that we've engaged in. And I'll come back to this at the end. And if you get a chance, take a look at the New York Times. You can get it off the internet, I'm sure. Page 18 today, which talks about a new bipartisan study that has come out. And that in effect says we need to make a significant turn. And I'll refer to some of the points that they make. Both because they make the points and I agree with them, and because in fact, as far as I'm concerned, those points are taken directly from the book that Dalia Mugahid and I did. In fact, she's quoted in the story. But let's start with the most fundamental question that was asked after 9/11. Why do they hate us? Why do they hate us? And better still, do they hate us? One of the realities that we often don't distinguish between is anti-Americanism and hatred of America. Hatred of America is a narrow phrase, and that refers to violent extremists who hate America and will engage in violence if they have the opportunity. Anti-Americanism is a far broader phenomenon. Just as when we went into Iraq and France didn't support us and there was anti-French attitudes, People may have said, we're not going to eat French fries, we're not going to go to France, but they weren't saying kill the French. We may be anti a number of countries' foreign policy, but it doesn't mean that we're going to invade them or that we want to kill them. So anti-Americanism is a very broad phenomenon that, as I said at the beginning of my talk, exists in many parts of the world with people who in fact admire us and admire our principles and values, but often do not feel that we live up to them. They may think that we're unilateral, we're arrogant, etc. But it's not as if they don't admire us, and that's why many of them come here, whether from Europe or the other parts of the world or the Arab and Muslim world. So we want to distinguish between anti-Americanism and hatred of America. But now let's deal with the question of why do they hate us? Well, the general approach was to say they hate us for who we are. And of course, we're going to define who we are, and we're going to put our first foot forward. So who are we? We're a democracy. We believe in gender equality. We believe in human rights. We believe in the rule of law. And they are all the opposite, obviously, to set up that tension. Well, let's take a look more closely. When we poll in the largest, most comprehensive and systematic poll of the Muslim world ever done, when we poll Muslims and we ask, what do you resent and what do you admire about the West? First thing we discover is that they admire a lot about the West. When you ask Americans, what do you admire about Islam and Muslims, 57% say nothing or I don't know. Nothing or I don't know. You have nothing like those percentages when you deal with the Muslim world. So let's start with what's admired, and then we'll move to what's resented. They admire our technology, our expertise, our knowledge, our work ethic. They admire our freedoms and our democracy. And guess what? When Americans were asked the same question, the top two responses were identical. To give you an idea from countries that you might not, when you hear the way in which we create countries in a monolithic fashion, you might not think some people in that country would say something like this. Saudi Arabia, we admire freedom of the press, opinion and expression, and America's scientific involvement. Iran, social justice and having access to nuclear power and being a real democracy. Pakistan, law is above all and everyone observes the law. Pakistan, again, their political system is transparent. Contrary to what might be assumed in light of the Danish cartoon crisis, Muslims around the world, in majorities greater than 90% in Egypt, Indonesia, and Iran, said they would include free speech as a guarantee in any constitution that they would draw up. When respondents were asked to describe their dreams for the future, they didn't talk about waging jihad. They talked about better jobs, better economic well-being and prosperity, a better future for their children. Responses of 70% in Indonesia, 54% in Iran. But Muslims wish to achieve their progress, wish to achieve their freedoms, wish to achieve, if you will, democratization within their culture and society. Therefore, although the West is admired, few said adopting Western values wholesale would bring about Muslim progress. Instead, among the most frequent statements to be associated with the Muslim world was attachment to their spiritual and moral values. I'm dealing with a number of law cases in the United States involving Muslims. And you literally would get statements by people who testify that will say something like, well, this group or these people are particularly dangerous because when you look, they use the word God a lot in their discourse. It's really pretty interesting. They use the word God a lot. That means they're extreme. Kind of interesting, you know. I mean, it's like years ago, I remember people would always talk about how Roman Catholics were very extreme because of our positions, our theological positions, our social positions, etc. One might argue today they are getting extreme, but We won't go down that road. I'm not speaking about that tonight. It's on the DVD again. Okay, I got to be careful. All right, now. The next, and what about the West? How do Muslims view the West? Is it a blind hatred of the West? Guess what? They distinguish between what two countries and what other countries? The U.S. and Britain on the one hand, France, Germany, and other European countries on the other. They distinguish between Bush and Blair and the leaders of France and Germany with remarkable disparities in the percentages. Remarkable disparities in the percentages. What is the issue? Is the driving force policy or is it religion? Muslims, as I said, don't see the West as monolithic. For example, 74% of Egyptians have unfavorable views of the United States, and 69% say the same about Britain, but only 21% have unfavorable views about France, and 30% express this view of Pakistan, so they can also be critical of their own countries. On the other hand, let's look at the U.S. and Canada. We describe Canada as America without America's foreign policy. 67% of Kuwaitis have unfavorable views of the United States. What's Kuwaiti attitudes towards Canada unfavorable? 3%. 64% of Malaysians say the U.S. is aggressive, while only 1 in 10 associate that quality with France and Germany. So the driver here is policy. It doesn't mean that religion doesn't become important. Religion becomes a way to legitimate and mobilize. The example I give is, if you go to war and you're a socialist, a Marxist, a secularist, and on the other hand, you're a devout Christian, for example, all may go to war to defend their country. All may go to war for the sake of social justice. But each will frame and legitimate why they're doing it in terms of their basic ideology and values. And if you're a Christian, you will not only have your secular commitment to social justice, you will root that in your religious text, your religious history, your religious values. But the driver often will be policy. What is Muslims' main concern in this area of policy? What is regarded as Western hypocrisy. Many Muslims around the world admire Western values, believe that some Western powers, though, do not live these values in their treatment of Muslims. In other words, again, we stand for democracy, we stand for human rights, but we support countries like Egypt, of which some human rights reports have in the past referred to their record as its record as 10 years of torture. So there's that sense of a disjuncture, a double standard when it comes to the promotion of democracy. In Egypt, 72% doubt American promises of democratic support, even though we advocate the promotion. In Pakistan, 55%. Doubting American intentions with regard to democracy are closely tied with the perception that America is an imperial power that controls the region. On 9/12, the day after 9/11, a prominent Muslim academic, public intellectual, mother of four, wrote to me and said, "It's terrible what's happened. We hope that you and your family are okay. We understand that you will want to go after Osama bin Laden, but we wonder whether this is the beginning or the end." And I emailed back and said, "What do you mean?" And she answered just as I thought. Will this become an excuse for America redrawing the map of the Middle East and the Muslim world? In other words, will America become a new colonial power? You remember that the French said it was their mission to civilize, the British, it was the white man's burden, and some believe that American neocolonialism is in the name of democratizing, of liberating, of freeing. Now remember what happened. Before we were even, and we're not finished in Afghanistan, we were already talking about second frontiers. Would it be the Philippines? Would it be Somalia? And then we talked about axis of evil countries, all of which, with the exception of Korea, were Muslim. But only Korea, North Korea, had nuclear power and was using it in our face. and yet we always insisted we could deal with them diplomatically. Whereas a country like Syria, which doesn't have nuclear power, but which is regarded as a military threat, Iran, which doesn't have it, but is regarded as a potential nuclear threat, there have been those that have been very free to talk about a military rather than a diplomatic solution, and to threaten that kind of thing. I mean, there's been free talk, as you know, about whether or not we would find it useful at some point to bomb Iran, or to support Israel bombing Iran. Or Israelis have said that they think the U.S. ought to, think about, bombing Iran in certain situations, its potential nuclear installations. What Muslims say they admire most about the West, they associate most strongly with the U.S. and the U.K., and that is civil liberties, citizen liberties. Yet at the same time, they believe the U.S. is denying Muslims their same rights to self-determination. In other words, the belief is if you do promote democracy, you don't promote it where your authoritarian regimes are in your interest. So Egypt and Saudi Arabia and others, you drag your feet. Pakistan under Musharraf. On the other hand, you promote it in Iraq, but only if it is an American-approved form of democracy or self-determination. Only if America is able to define the nature of that government, who the key players are, etc. And that becomes the concern. So what we have is a gap perceived between our espoused values of democracy, human rights, and self-determination on the one hand, and our perceived treatment of Muslims. In the bipartisan report I just talked about that says we need to turn the corner, two of its key points are the main tool to be used is diplomatic engagement. The main tool is diplomatic engagement. Note, they didn't say the main tool is military or the threat of military. Not that military doesn't work. I briefed the head of the Army when we were going into Afghanistan, and I briefed many people at the Pentagon. What military people will tell you consistently is that the military is equipped to fight, capture, contain, and kill terrorists. It is not equipped to fight a war against global terrorism. A war against global terrorism is far more than about a military campaign. Okay. And even with regard to Iran, what they talk about is diplomacy first in this report. How about the situation of Americans on the other hand? Here's some statistics. Americans were asked how much prejudice they had, if any, against a number of religious groups. While 72% of Americans said they had no prejudice towards Jews, only 34% could say the same about Muslims. And 19% of Americans said they had a great deal of prejudice towards Muslims, not simply towards Muslim extremists, towards Muslims. 32% of Americans said they admire nothing about the Muslim world, 25% admitted they simply don't know. Nearly 1/4 of Americans say they would not want a Muslim as a neighbor. 44% say Muslims are devout, and as a result, they regard that as extreme. As extreme. I remember being a celibate for quite a few years, and my brother coming up with some of his friends who were of other faiths and no faith, and they couldn't understand how a healthy male could be a celibate. This was incredibly extreme. And they would keep asking questions like, well, how do you deal with that? You knew they were fishing around. I won't spell out exactly what their options were. But it wasn't do you play a lot of sports? That wasn't the issue. They figured sex had to be there. The question is, there must be some way in which you do something and you don't talk about it. Or, one does. It just seemed like such an extreme option that a male would opt for that for a lifetime, or even to have been celibate for 10 years. What do I care? As I said to my mother one day, I said, Mom, you don't know. I'm the only verifiable virgin in this family because I was in the monastery. My mother, a little Italian woman, sort of took that in two different ways. As she used to say to people all the time, he was such a good boy before he went off to the monastery. He never talked like this. Okay. Less than half of Americans believe U.S. Muslims can be loyal citizens. Remember World War II? Some of us remember that. I don't, thank God. I can say I was a little too young for that. I was around, but a little too young. But they had signs up, don't speak the enemy's language. And they were talking about Italian, German, and Japanese. To have that sign up went right at the heart of whether or not mainstream people of that background could be loyal citizens. Okay. Let's talk about the issue of women and democracy. Well, the interesting thing, as Karen Hughes discovered, who was the head of our public diplomacy when she went to the Middle East and spoke to women in places like Turkey and Saudi Arabia and initially wanted to relate to them in terms of the problems that women have, was that their first reaction was, what are you doing in Iraq? Why are you killing all of those Iraqis? And so what one discovered was that Muslim women, like Muslim men, are first and foremost human beings, Muslims concerned about other Muslims, family people, and they see Iraqi lives as important. We all know, almost to a person, how many Americans have been killed in Iraq. I wonder how many of us have a clue as to how many Iraqis have been killed, how many have been injured. Now, does it mean that women aren't concerned about women's issues? Does it mean that it's not? Oh, they are. But as citizens, it's not their first issue. Their issues are peace, security, development, their family. But are they concerned? Yes. And the surprising thing is that majorities of Muslim women in most Muslim countries of the 35 surveyed said that women should have equal rights of citizenship, education, employment to pick the job they want, and senior positions in government. And the more surprising thing, given the patriarchal nature of many societies in the Middle East, is that majorities of men in most countries took the same position. Now, why that doesn't exist in many Muslim countries and societies is a question we can address that goes more to the politics of the society than it does to the aspirations of the people. What about terrorism? What about Muslim sympathy for terrorism? Many charge that Islam, not Muslim extremists alone, but Islam encourages violence more than other faiths. But studies show that Muslims around the world are at least as likely as Americans to condemn terrorism and to condemn attacks against civilians. For example, polls show that 6% of the American public, with regard to attacks against civilians, thinks that attacks in which civilians are targets can be completely justified. 6% believe that. In Saudi Arabia, only 4% believe that. In Iran, the shocker, only 2%. Mr. Ahmadinejad does not represent the majority of the Iranian people. How do I know that? I've been going there since the Iranian Revolution regularly. Moreover, it's politics, not piety, that drives the minority. In our study, we distinguish between mainstream Muslims and the politically radicalized. Now, pay attention to this. It's not that difficult, but initially, it's important to see this distinction. The key question that determines whether you're mainstream or politically radicalized is, do you think 9/11 was justified? Do you think 9/11 was justified? Even, this many years after. 93% of Muslims say it was unjustified. Now, that doesn't mean that they're all strongly pro-American, but they believe that's unjustified and it should have never happened to America. About half have major problems with American foreign policy, the other half not as strong. But 90 to 93% feel 9/11 was unjustified. 7%, now that's not really that small a number, because 7% of 1.3 billion would be 91 million people. 7% believe 9/11 was justified. But let's unpack this. We call them politically radicalized. We don't call them extremist and terrorist because they don't engage in violence and they're not advocating wholesale violence. But let's look at the profile of these politically radicalized compared to the mainstream. Are they all people who live in refugee camps? No. The 7% are A, better educated than the mainstream, B, more internationally aware. C, have better jobs. D, are more optimistic about their personal future, but not about their country, their region, and their part of the world's future. And here's the shocker for many people. The politically radicalized, even more than the mainstream, believe that democracy is the way to progress and that relations with the West are important. But the politically radicalized, compared to the mainstream, are far more cynical about whether or not that will ever happen. In other words, the politically radicalized are people whose primary fears are Western intervention, invasion, interference, domination. The politically radicalized, when it comes to democracy, are far more prone to think that the West will never allow real self-determination, but rather it will allow some form of democratization that it is able to somehow control or control the end result. And if the end result is not acceptable, it will reject free and fair elections if it yields a result that is not favored. Now, let me end with the following observation, and I think this is very important in terms of what we're about tonight and what the next president has to realize. If you ask people in America, are people in the Muslim world really concerned about good relations with the West and willing to work for it? Vast majority say no. If you ask people in the Muslim world the same question, same answer, almost around the same percentage, in fact, okay, in terms of negativity. But what's the reality? Each side does care. Each side does care. Majorities. But note the difference in approach. Muslims in the Muslim world, I'm not talking about in America, etc. Not that this might not be the case, but I'm just dealing with Muslim countries. In Muslim countries, majorities in Muslim countries, like majorities in America, believe that the way forward is education and exchange. We need a lot of, more getting to know more about each other through our educational systems, training for a globalized world, etc., and through exchange. But we stop there. Majorities of Americans stop. We can't think of anything else. You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, that's what we can do. For significant numbers of Muslims, the next factor is policy. In other words, it's not just what you say and what you believe, it's what we perceive or feel you're doing. That you either do or would do, that you would interfere, that you would invade, that you will support authoritarian regimes, and you do, that you will occupy, that you will exempt yourself from international standards that you hold other people to. So the policy focus comes into play. So in conclusion, and now I'll draw my conclusion, but my points of my conclusion I just want to underscore. This works out perfectly today, since I believe that I am divinely inspired, but that's another story. I used to, this is true. I remember saying to my wife, I never thought I'd live beyond 33. And when I was going to Catholic school, the whole idea was Jesus died at 33. So one could begin to talk about complexes there. But I was telling some Muslims in Bosnia this story, and I said, and here I am, this was a number of years ago, I said, and here I am, I'm 63. At which point they said, the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, died at 63. So I looked at them and said, what are you saying? I made it through 33, I'm celebrating, and now you're telling me the Prophet died at 63. This means I got 1 year to live. All right, but I've challenged that. But what this newspaper talked about today are the exact points that I would make at the end, and that we make in our book, and that I've made in a lot of my writing for years, as have some other colleagues. And basically what we've said is the primary driver is politics, not religion. Religion does play a role in legitimating, mobilizing, etc., okay? But it's primarily political and economic grievances, fear of occupation. Read a book, better still, get some of his articles. You can get a good article by Robert Pape, P-A-P-E, on suicide bombing. He wrote a book called Dying to Win, and he looked at suicide bombing across religions and across cultures over a 25-year period. His conclusion is, in rare cases, is the primary driver religion. More often than not, it's political, and particularly the perception or experience of occupation that drives people to commit acts of terror, including suicide bombing. In any case, what I would be saying to the next president is we have to espouse a dramatic turn in American foreign policy. And what does that turn entail? Number one, realizing that what nations are about is diplomacy and negotiation. That's what nations are about. We have lots of nations that are our allies, not because we like them, because we love them, but because we think that there are common interests. If not shared values, common interest. With others, we think we have shared values and common interest. But that diplomacy has to be the primary driver. If we think that a military mode is going to solve anything, military mode in terms of the fight against terrorism is not decreased. Attacks significantly, not decreased the growth of terrorism. But the military option is important in instances, as is the economic. But the most important part is public diplomacy. And where the Bush administration has failed, and failed at times by its own admission, when President Bush appointed Karen Hughes, his longtime friend, as the head of public diplomacy, one of the points made was that our public diplomacy wasn't succeeding. Part of the reason is that public diplomacy is not just about public relations. People dislike us not just because they don't know us. People who are anti-American in Europe or even in the Muslim world, many of them are well-educated, many of them have studied here, come here. It's that they have a problem with our policies, or at least their perception of our policies. And so public diplomacy has to be a combination of looking at having an aggressive public relations, if you will, or public outreach, but also emphasizing diplomacy and policy. And when it comes to policy, it has to be that your primary tool is diplomatic engagement. Your fallback tool is military action and response. Remember how, when we were going to go into Iraq, what prevented the president from going in was not just that we hadn't found the weapons of mass destruction, but that even senior Republican advisors of the past, Kissinger, a whole host, Scowcroft and others, were saying stay the course for the time being. In other words, don't use the military option yet. Continue to use the diplomacy option. That's one. The second is a no-brainer. Significant economic, technological, and job development. We see that in terms of what people across the Muslim world want and need, but we also see both President Bush and Tony Blair, when we first went into Afghanistan and into Iraq, promising that significant, and it never occurred. If you go into a country, even in a just situation, and you destroy the infrastructure and you don't rebuild it, what are you going to have? Now, for many Americans, it was very distasteful after a bloody war with Germany and with Japan to invest what we invested in rebuilding those countries. But it ultimately proved to be a smart measure. So a strong emphasis on economic, technological, and job support. And by the way, if you're saying, why don't Arabs and Muslims also do it? Arabs and Muslims fail like everybody else often in doing what they ought to do. But I can tell you that Sheikh Hamoza of Qatar, the wife of the Emir of Qatar, announced last year at the UN Alliance of Civilizations, of which I'm a member, a $100 million gift to develop jobs for Arab youth. So there's a real recognition out there that it's a big issue and it needs to be addressed. What we need to do is to realize, as Madeleine Albright said, Madeleine Albright, who said that when she was Secretary of State, she never took religion seriously as a variable, a significant variable, which is true, by the way, in general, in international relations and diplomacy. It wasn't taken seriously. But Madeleine Albright now says, as have others, this isn't a clash of civilizations or a clash of religions. This isn't a clash between the West and Muslim religious and cultural beliefs. It's a clash that is driven by policy. And so we have to look at What are the policies that we have? And it's also a clash between preachers of hate. We have preachers of hate on all sides who want to provoke a clash for political reasons or for religious reasons. But they are the minority in our society. Majorities of people aren't thinking of that. And the final point is, as I say in all of my talks, we all have a role to play. I mean, the great thing is that if you look at the world today, it's like my saying to you, gee, we're having these economic problems, and you're saying, I'm really too busy. I've got a job, I'm planning a vacation, I'm leaving on my vacation, and, I'll just leave that up to Washington. Well, for how many of us do we now feel, I don't know if I quite want to just leave it up to Washington. And I'm wondering who in Washington, is it going to be the Congress, the administration, Or you get a call from your broker and you begin to think, wait a minute, did this guy ever work for Bear Stearns? Or did she ever work for, Lehman Brothers? And, what quite does that? In other words, we realize now more and more that in our critical issues we have to be concerned. As I say to people, part of growing up, and I hated this part, when you're a kid and you get sick and the doctor comes in, everything's going to be okay. And even when you grow up, something goes wrong, you go to the doctor and you just feel that whatever the doctor says, got a problem, go to a lawyer. When you grow up, you realize doctors and lawyers are as good as everybody else in our society. Some of them are good, some of them aren't. Some of them are well-trained, some of them aren't. A whole group may be well-trained, but some of them keep up, some of them don't. Some of them give you the time of day, some of them don't. And religious leaders are like that, and so are political leaders. And so we all have an investment. And this is why I think our elections are so important, the presidential elections, congressional elections. You can't do what we did years ago. After 9/11, I had senior members of Congress and the Senate say to me, I'm really sorry to say this, but when it came to the Middle East, I never paid attention to it. I left it to my senior advisors. Had people in the office, they would brief me, we'd go for a vote, and I'd vote. And so as one of the leading people said, he said, now I'm dealing with a world in which I need to know about Islam and Muslims. I need to know about the Middle East because I realize, what an issue it is. And in a funny kind of way, we're not all going to be masters of the economy, which you have to do to be smart like me. You get a wife who understands it all, and then you just say, great, hon, you take care of it. It's a great win. My wife's good at it, but if it doesn't work, I can always smile and say, I didn't do that. She doesn't know that quite, but now that's on the DVD too. So she does not get to see this DVD. But I mean, what we realize now in our own lives is life has become so complicated that on the one hand, we feel it's too complicated to stay on top of these things. On the other hand, who's going to stay on top of it for us? I mean, that's part of the challenge. And so we all have an obligation to be able to be aware as voters, but also to be aware in our communities. Yes, if we can identify enemies, we should be concerned about those enemies. But if we don't take an interest in identifying those enemies, then what are we going to do when it comes to our leaders saying we need to invade country X? Or when our leaders say we need to cut back on civil liberties? And just war is irrelevant. International law in terrorism is irrelevant. Torture, maybe we just need to use it. And it's true, there's no problem torturing somebody else. It's when you're getting tortured. I became nonviolent when I was in not quite a gang war, it'd be too romantic, but basically a good street fight in Brooklyn that was a sort of pseudo-gang war. And I was always somebody who didn't like to fight, but I decided I'm going to get in, and I took on somebody I knew I could take. They didn't tell me his name was Crazy Louie. And I remember Crazy Louie waking up and his taking my head and bouncing it off the curb, etc. And so suddenly I had a sense of what it meant. I could watch somebody else or hear somebody else punch somebody out, but when you actually get punched out, the same thing happens with, you can read about somebody else's house being invaded, but what happens when it's you or your neighbor? Then you realize that when you walk into your class and two of your students have had their home raided, have had the door broken down, have had their parents handcuffed, and never found guilty of anything to this day. When a good friend of yours, who, by the way, just by coincidence happened to die yesterday of something different, but this very sensitive Egyptian woman, brilliant scholar, and one of those, you know how some people are very nervous and they always look very jumpy? She's in bed, her husband's not home, Her front door, they knock and ring the doorbell, she doesn't hear it. American security breaks down the door, rushes her bedroom, surrounds her bed with automatic weapons, and she wakes up and sees all these guys surrounding her bed. Never found guilty of anything. So our challenge as Americans, it seems to me, is to be concerned about America, to be concerned about our values, our principles, to be concerned about our future, to be concerned about global terrorism, but it's also to be concerned about who we are. We all grew up knowing what America stands for, the set of principles and values that we stand for internationally and domestically. And it's our job to make sure that 5, 10 years from now, we can still see that as part of the American landscape. Thank you. We have about 10 minutes for questions, answers, no long speeches. How many of you remember Leslie Gore, the singer? Okay. Remember her song, It's My Party? Okay, it's my party. Now, I tell my students that because they don't know the song. The next line is, I'll cry if I want to. But it's my party, so if you want to give a speech, get the chancellor to invite you. But other than that, let's do questions, or, if you want to be kind of short, I disagree with you because, but very brief, okay? Anybody?
I have one.
Yeah.
You stated that the problem with Muslims and women is political.
Wait a second. Could you raise your hand who's ever talking?
Yes, sir. I'm to your right. Up here.
Oh, okay. It makes me feel, I'm hearing voices. Yeah, go ahead.
You said that the problem with Muslim women was politically driven and not religiously driven. But I was in Afghanistan 7 months after the Taliban fell, working in the largest women's hospital in the country. They did not have running water. They did not have electricity. They did not have screens on the windows. I went to the largest men's hospital in Kabul. They had air conditioning and completely modern facilities. And when I asked the Minister of Public Health why that was, he said it was because women were only worth 25% as much as any male, and they were not going to invest economically in saving women's lives.
Yeah. What I said was, just to get this straight, I said that in referring to the question of politics and terrorism, that the driver is politics and not religion. I didn't say that with regard to women's status. I talked about what women want. There's no doubt that religion plays a role, but that's not peculiar to Islam. If you look at the past in terms of Judaism and Christianity, historically, these traditions were developed, and the role of women, gender roles, were defined in patriarchal societies by the good old boys. And therefore, women had a secondary status. The reality today in many parts of the Muslim world is that you still have patriarchal societies. And if you're talking about Afghanistan, and I think you said Afghanistan, right? Afghanistan is a very tribal, patriarchal society. And also, by the way, his statement is inaccurate, even in terms of Islamic patriarchy, as it were, interpretations. But the fact is that there's no doubt about it. Part of the secondary status of women is a secondary status legitimated in the name of religion. Now, that has occurred in the past socially with regard to women's rights in a lot of religious traditions in terms of marriage, in terms of inheritance, etc., as well as even today. There still are, without my getting into the specific denominations in Christianity and Judaism, there are traditions where women are ordained, and there are traditions where they are not. And often those who are against the ordination come up with a religious interpretation, often for a position that I believe was developed years ago in a patriarchal society. So there's no doubt about it. And in significant sectors of the Muslim world, people will justify everything from discrimination against women to violence against women, and use religion. So they won't just say that socially they are, for example, not the equal of men. They'll say that somehow it's a religious prescription. No, that's there. Yeah.
What role did diplomatic engagement play or fail to play in the fall of the Shah of Iran?
You know, it's funny, the acoustics here are very difficult. I heard something about the fall of the Shah of Iran. What was the first part?
What role did diplomatic engagement play or fail to play in the fall of the Shah of Iran?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think that, part of the problem that we had, if you go back and you look at the Shah, okay, and his history. In the West, the Shah was our kind of guy. He had a gorgeous wife. When he would go on our morning TV shows, he was dressed Western. They spoke well, you know what I mean? They quote, sort of looked like us. And the Shah also seemed to be an enlightened ruler. He had lots of oil wealth. He had developed a modernization program. But at closer look, what you didn't see is that most of the modernization took place in urban centers. It was mostly driven and favored an already established elite. The Shah, for example, just fluffed off. He was talking about villages in Iran and what they needed, and he gave the number of villages, and he was way off. And somebody quoted the number, and it was like, it doesn't matter. With that communicated to people. The fact is, as much as we may look at Iran today and see all kinds of complexities, in terms of democratization of education, if you know what I mean, in terms of social class and education, far better today than years ago. In terms of women in universities, a far better situation than years ago. In terms of healthcare services in villages and rural areas, post-Shah, far better than there were. And so in a lot of our diplomatic relations, what we didn't realize was that we were supporting, whether it was the Shah or even Anwar Sadat, we were supporting rulers that were unpopular, not only to their religious extremists, but often had a great deal of unpopularity within their own country. I mean, I'll end my answer with just this note. You remember when Sadat went to Jerusalem and he was celebrated and received the Nobel? Okay? His foreign minister, this was never reported, resigned. The head of lawyers for the nation resigned. It was very unpopular among the Egyptian people, very popular among the American people. When Sadat died, the number of people who were in the streets were relatively negligible who turned out for his funeral. This is not meant as an attack on Anwar Sadat. It's just that often in our diplomacy, what we have emphasized is, are you a good ally? And are you a good ally means on the critical issues that we have in terms of our interests, can we count on you? And we've looked the other way when it's come to issues of a lack of democratization, repression, etc. We've just looked the other way. And we still have those examples today. Read about Egyptian elections in the last year or two. Look at Tunisia, where you have a ruler who wins by 99.91% of the vote. I think in the last elections he had a terrible time. He won by 95%. I mean, those are issues you want to, and these are our allies, whom we praise. Yeah.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for your work and your service. And my question is, at the chance of you risking your independent political position, do you see a candidate that you feel is more uniquely qualified or qualified to help resolve our differences with the Arab nations and to ease terrorism around the world?
Yeah, let me begin by saying I'm a lifelong Democrat who voted for Barry Goldwater, picked Nixon over Kennedy even though I wasn't old enough to vote, who was touted as having undue influence on the first Clinton term, and I never voted for President Clinton. So now when I speak, I don't do this to just kind of put this all out there, because given the position I'm coming down with, it's not a knee-jerk Democrat response. I think there is, first, I think that in the eyes of much of the world, whether it's the Arab Muslim world, in Europe, in many places, and we know this, the difference in the perception of Obama and McCain is like night and day. Obama is somebody that people are welcoming as an internationalist who they believe can relate to and identify with international issues and do a better job. My own position, and of course they don't vote, so I mean it's not that they're important, but I'm saying in terms of international relations, in terms of my own assessment, I just think that Mr. McCain is, I say this with, I'm not comfortable, I believe what I'm saying, but I'm not comfortable going down this road necessarily. I think he's the wrong man at the wrong time. I think that his knee-jerk reaction is military option, not diplomacy. His language is provocative. He uses phrases like Islamofascism. He plays the terrorism card to the extent that I think terrorism is important, but I mean, even Karl Rove admitted that his main advice to Bush both times he ran was play the security and terrorism card, because that's what will make Americans, even Americans who might not vote, go that route. And I think as a result, Mr. McCain is seen more as, yes, one can celebrate the fact that he was a decorated warrior, but you know, Audie Murphy was the most decorated warrior in World War II. It didn't mean that we expected that that would make Audie Murphy a great internationalist or et cetera. And I worry about a lot of Mr. McCain's policy statements in the past when it comes to international relations, and certainly both his rhetoric and his policy recommendations when it comes to the Arab and Muslim world. I think, on the other hand, I think Obama is far more of an internationalist. It's not that he's not willing to use the military, because he was the one who, remember, said at one point that if he needed to, he'd go into Pakistan unilaterally. I don't think that was the greatest statement to make at that particular point in time, because there was no, from my point of view, there was no clear and present danger to make it. But the fact is, you know, Obama, like others, like other responsible politicians, Republican and Democrat, Mr. Lugar and others, talk about the need to emphasize diplomacy. That statement in the New York Times that I talked about, Mr. Lugar is circulating that statement to many Republicans, you know, where you need to emphasize the diplomatic engagement. So I think right now, I mean, I would sort of favor Obama. I think on international affairs, the difference between the vice presidential candidates is like night and day. I mean, just night and day. And I think that if one wants to refute that, it's okay. But then what one needs to see is we need to see both the Republican candidates out there in public being interviewed by the media consistently on international affairs. And the vice presidential nominee has avoided that consistently. And if she can rise to the occasion, that's great. But I think that we've got to get that out there. We're in very, very risky times. We cannot afford another screw-up. Afghanistan is spiraling out of control. I mean, that's a reality. It's not that any particular candidate says that. Pakistan the situation in Pakistan is very sensitive. Iraq, yes, the violence stopped in Iraq, but you know, you take a ghetto area and you pump in another 5,000 policemen, you'll see crime go down. The question is what happens when the 5,000 policemen come out? And that's one of the issues. Now, if we can get the Iraqis to move forward in building their military, and if we can get them to move forward politically, and so our having our forces in there during this period and keeping the violence down then provides a context for this growth, that would be great. But we cannot say that we've turned that corner at all. Even General Petraeus, every time he makes a statement, you note that he would always couch it and kind of say, things right now are, but, you know, I'm not saying there's light at the end of the tunnel. So, I mean, we're looking at a lot of places in the world that are extraordinarily sensitive, and where it seems to me diplomacy is really important, and having that diplomatic style. And I think that that's what we really need to emphasize. So, yeah, you know, Obama may not have been my perfect candidate, but that's where I am. Now, let me end with this. Whether it's Obama or Mr. McCain on the Arab-Israeli crisis, I don't think that they'll be significantly different, but that's for other reasons. So I'm not saying that electing Obama over McCain means, you know, peace in Israel and Palestine. One more, I'm being told. You pick the person because, and I want you to note that she picked and she didn't pick the rest of you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
How will we best engage China as a partner, especially with their growing economic power and our possible weakness What's the best way to engage China?
You know, I'm not a China expert, but I want to point something out to all of you. The reality of it is, and this is an interesting statement that actually other people have made this, but President Clinton, after he left office, held his first global meeting, which I attended. And in fact, I helped organize it. And it was kind of funny because my wife said to me, all these years you've been denying that you've ever met President Clinton, and now he calls the House and asks you to organize something. When you organize it, people are going to say you've been lying all these years. But we did the program. But one of the things that struck me about what Clinton said was warning Americans and saying, look, all nations rise and fall. In fact, I was in Amsterdam on the weekend, and on CNN they were talking about banking and our crisis, but they were pointing out that the Netherlands used to be the banking center of the world, then Britain, then the US, and it could become China. You know, but for those of us in our generations, we don't think of that. You know, we don't realize that we could become like Britain and France, where you go from being a great imperial power to being a relatively modest, etc. And I think now when people talk about Chindia, China and India, and the fact that in 30 years they could be major economic, that's a challenge, potential threat. But China much more than India because of the size of its military. And because China, in terms of its government, is so much different than India. India has problems, but India is a semi-functioning democracy. Or if you know what I mean. When I say democracy, I mean a kind of political participation, inclusiveness with all the problems. China doesn't have any of that, so that I think that, you know, managing China, within a short period of time, we're going to be thinking, when we talk about major threats, and I think even when people go to vote, it's going to be the economy, and I think in about 5 years, it's going to be our China policy. And I think any president's going to have to really be thinking about the fact that it's China on the horizon that is the potential threat, not only to the US, but to other areas globally, unless China also changes its value structure. And it doesn't. During the Olympics, that was a fraud. I mean, you know, given what China does and the way it treats its population. And, you know, the Uyghurs, if you read about it in Xinjiang, they kept talking about how they were fighting terrorists. That's a fraud. This has been going on for ages. They basically moved mainland Chinese into the western provinces, gave them property, jobs. This has been going on for decades. And they have been suppressing and repressing these people. And they distracted from Tibet during the Olympics by talking about the Uyghurs because they have a Muslim background and saying, they're Muslim, therefore they are extremist. And so unless we realize that when you start talking about what are Chinese values at the end of the day, beyond the economic values, what are their human values, you know, both with regard to their population as well as the world, we've got a major issue. Thank you all for coming.